Hello and welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to do something a little different. We're not just talking about specs or benchmarks, we're going on a journey. A journey back in time to uncover the hidden story of the very heart of your computer. You see, beneath the fans and heat sinks, there's a small square, a stage upon which the entire drama of modern computing has played out. I'm talking about the CPU socket. Let's rewind the clock to 1995. The internet was just starting to crawl into our homes. Windows 95 was the talk of the town, and personal computing was exploding. It was a wild, exciting time. In the middle of this digital gold rush, there was a need for some kind of order, a common ground. And in the world of processors, that common ground was called Socket 7. Now you have to understand, before Socket 7, things were a bit of a mess. Different CPUs often needed different motherboards. It was a headache for manufacturers, and for the brave souls building their own PCs. Socket 7 changed that. Initially designed by Intel for its revolutionary Pentium processors, it did something remarkable. It became a universal standard. This wasn't just Intel's playground. Companies like AMD and Cyrix could create their own CPUs that would fit and work in the very same socket. Imagine it like this. What if today you could take the engine out of a Ford and drop it right into a Toyota? No questions asked. That was the magic of Socket 7. It was a 3-on-21-pin grid, a simple but elegant design that supported a whole range of speeds, from a modest 75 MHz all the way up to 233 MHz. For the user, this was freedom. You weren't locked into one brand. You could shop around, find the best price, the best performance, and know that it would work. Upgrading was simple and, most importantly, affordable. The heart of this system was something called the front side bus, or FSB, which ran at 66 MHz. Think of the FSB as the main highway between your CPU and the rest of your computer. 66 MHz might sound slow today, but back then, it was the speed of progress. But this era of peace and unity was, sadly, short-lived. While Intel was ready to move on to its next big thing, AMD saw an opportunity. They took the Socket 7 design and supercharged it, creating what they called Super Socket 7. They cranked up that highway speed, the FSB, to 100 MHz and added support for a new graphics port. This clever move extended the life of the platform, allowing AMD to offer competitive, budget-friendly systems for a few more years. It was a brilliant piece of engineering jujitsu, using the incumbent's own standard against them. However, this was the last time we'd see such camaraderie. The battle lines were being drawn. Intel was about to make a move so radical, it would physically change the shape of the CPU, and the era of a single, unified standard was coming to a dramatic end. The universal playground was about to be divided into two fiercely guarded kingdoms. Have you ever owned a machine from this era? I'd love to hear about your first Pentium or AMD K6 build down in the comments. The year is 1997. The dot-com bubble is inflating, and technology is moving at a breakneck pace. In this climate of bold bets and rapid innovation, Intel decided to break from tradition in the most dramatic way possible. They looked at the flat, square CPU in its socket and decided it wasn't enough. It was time for a revolution. It was time for slot 1. Gone was the familiar pin grid array. In its place was a large black plastic cartridge, something that looked more like an old video game cartridge than a computer processor. When you installed a Pentium 2, or later a Pentium 3, you weren't carefully lowering a chip into a socket. You were sliding a hefty cartridge into a vertical slot on the motherboard. It was a radical departure, and for good reason. The problem Intel was trying to solve was cache memory. Cache is a small, super-fast type of memory that sits right next to the processor's main cores, holding frequently used data so the CPU doesn't have to wait for the much slower main system RAM. Getting this cache to run at the full speed of the processor was difficult and expensive to manufacture directly on the CPU die at the time. Intel's clever, if complicated solution was to put the CPU core on a small circuit board inside the cartridge, and then place separate, high-speed cache memory chips right next to it on that same board. This design simplified manufacturing and allowed them to deliver high-performance cache, giving them a significant edge. Of course, AMD couldn't just stand by and let Intel change the game. They responded with their own version, Slot A. Launched with their groundbreaking Athlon processors, Slot A looked almost identical to Intel EEC Slot 1. You could hold the two cartridges side by side and easily mistake them. But this was a classic case of technological deception. While they were physically the same, they were electrically completely different. You could never plug an Intel chip into an AMD board, or vice versa. AMD's Slot A had a secret weapon, the EV6 bus protocol. This was a technology licensed from the high-end server company Digital Equipment Corporation, and it was a game changer. It allowed AMD's Athlon processors to communicate with the rest of the system far more efficiently than Intel's platform, giving AMD a genuine performance advantage for the first time in its history. The war for the desktop had truly begun. But this cartridge revolution was destined to be short-lived. As manufacturing technology improved at an incredible rate, it soon became possible to integrate that fast cache memory directly onto the main CPU die, just as it had been before. This was cheaper, more efficient, and offered even better performance. The giant cartridges and their complex internal circuit boards were no longer necessary. The industry's brief, bold experiment was over. It was time to go back to the socket. This era serves as a powerful reminder that sometimes the most radical-looking solution is just a temporary bridge to an even better, more elegant design. As the new millennium dawned, the age of the chunky cartridge was fading as quickly as it had arrived. The industry had learned its lesson, and manufacturing had caught up. It was time to return to the elegance and simplicity of the socket. But this was not a retreat. It was a strategic redeployment. Both Intel and AMD came back to the classic PGA, pin grid array, layout, but they did so on their own terms, solidifying the architectural divide that defines the market to this day. Intel led the charge with Socket 370. Initially launched for its budget Celeron processors, it quickly became the home for the mighty Pentium III as well. This return to a square socket was a huge win for system builders. It was more compact, which meant smaller motherboards, and ultimately, smaller computers. More importantly, it made cooling simpler. The flat surface of the CPU was much easier to attach a heatsink to than the awkward plastic cartridge. This focus on cost-effectiveness and thermal efficiency made Socket 370 a massive commercial success, powering countless home and office PCs of the early 2000s. Meanwhile, AMD was forging its own path with the legendary Socket A, also known as Socket 462. This platform would become the foundation of AMD's golden era. It was the home for their powerful Athlon and budget-friendly Duron processors. Socket A was all about pushing the performance envelope. While Intel was focused on its own architecture, AMD was aggressively ramping up the front-side bus speed. They introduced double data rate, DDR technology to the bus, effectively doubling the communication speed between the CPU and the chipset, pushing it to an impressive 200 MHz and beyond. What made Socket A so beloved was its incredible longevity. For years, AMD released new, faster processors that would still fit in the same socket. This meant that if you bought a Socket A motherboard, you had a clear and affordable upgrade path for a long time. It built a loyal following of enthusiasts who appreciated the value and performance AMD was offering. This was the era where the lines were truly drawn. If you were building a PC, you were either on Team Blue, Intel, or Team Red, AMD. There was no in-between. This period marked the final, definitive separation. The dream of a universal standard like Socket 7 was now a distant memory. The market was now a fierce duopoly. Intel and AMD were on parallel but completely distinct evolutionary tracks. Their sockets were incompatible, their chipsets were different, and their philosophies were diverging. Intel was the established giant, focused on stability and market share. AMD was the scrappy underdog, focused on aggressive performance and value. This competitive tension would drive innovation for the next decade, and it all played out on these two small but incredibly important sockets. By 2004, the world of computing was about to experience a fundamental shift in design philosophy, and it came from Intel. For decades, one thing had been constant. The CPU had hundreds of delicate, fragile pins on its underside, and the motherboard had hundreds of tiny holes to receive them. Anyone who has ever built a PC from that era knows the sheer terror of lowering a CPU into place, praying you don't bend a single pin. A bent pin could mean a dead and very expensive processor. Intel decided it was time to end this anxiety. Their solution was both simple and revolutionary: LGA775. LGA stands for Land Grid Array, and it represented a complete reversal of the traditional design. With LGA775, Intel removed the pins from the CPU entirely. The underside of the processor was now a flat grid of 775 gold-plated contact pads. The fragile pins were moved to the motherboard socket itself, protected by a sturdy clamping mechanism. This was an act of genius. Why? Because a motherboard, while not cheap, was almost always less expensive than the high-end processor it housed. If a pin got bent, it was now on the socket, and replacing a motherboard was a far more palatable option than replacing a top-of-the-line CPU. This design massively improved durability and made the installation process virtually foolproof. The terror of the bent pin was gone. But the innovation of LGA775 went far beyond its physical design. This socket became one of the most iconic and long-lived platforms in desktop history. It had an incredible run, from 2004 all the way to 2011. It was the home for a huge range of processors, starting with the later Pentium 4 and Pentium D models. But most famously, it hosted the legendary Core 2 Duo and Core 2 Quad processors. These chips were a quantum leap in performance and efficiency, and they cemented Intel's dominance throughout the mid-2000s. LGA775 was also a bridge between two major memory technologies. Early motherboards for the socket supported the established DDR2 memory, but as technology progressed, later boards adopted the newer, faster DDR3. This flexibility gave the platform an extended life, allowing users to upgrade their systems piece by piece. You could buy an LGA775 board with a Core 2 Duo and DDR2, and a few years later, upgrade to a powerful Core 2 Quad and faster DDR3 without having to scrap your entire system. For an entire generation of PC builders and enthusiasts, LGA775 was the gold standard. It was reliable, it was powerful, and it was versatile. It represents a pivotal moment when the user experience, the simple act of building and upgrading, was given as much importance as raw performance. It was a masterpiece of practical engineering that set a new standard for every socket that would follow. What do you think? Was moving the pins to the motherboard one of the best design changes in PC history? Let me know your thoughts. Following the monumental success of LGA775, Intel entered a new phase. This wasn't about radical revolutions anymore. It was about refinement, integration, and solidifying their control over the mainstream desktop market. This new era was defined by a family of sockets that would power the vast majority of consumer PCs for an entire decade. The LGA115X series. The story began in 2009 with LGA1156. This socket launched with a processor series that is now a household name, the Core i series, Core i3, i5, and i7. But the real change was happening under the hood. For the first time, critical components that used to live on the motherboard's chipset, like the memory controller and the PCI Express controller for the graphics card, were integrated directly onto the CPU die. Think of it like this. Instead of the CPU having to shout across the motherboard to talk to its memory, it could now speak to it directly. This dramatically reduced latency and improved overall system performance and efficiency. It was a fundamental architectural shift that made PCs faster and motherboards simpler and cheaper to produce. From there, Intel began a steady, predictable cadence of releases. LGA1156 was followed by LGA11155 for the Sensi Sandy Bridge and Ivy Bridge processors, which brought huge leaps in performance and graphics capabilities. Then came LGA1150 for Haswell and Broadwell which focused on power efficiency, making laptops thinner and desktops cooler. Finally, we had the incredibly long-running LGA1200, which spanned multiple generations, from Yebas, Skylake to Coffee Lake, and introduced new features and more cores to the mainstream. Each new socket in the 115X family was an evolution, not a revolution. They shared the same basic design and a similar number of pins, the number in the name, but they were almost never backward compatible. A CPU designed for LGA1150 would not work in an LGA1155 board. This was often a point of frustration for users. While the changes seemed minor, differences in power delivery and chipset communication meant you almost always had to buy a new motherboard when you upgraded your CPU. This strategy, often criticized by enthusiasts, was undeniably successful for Intel. It created a reliable, yearly upgrade cycle that drove sales and kept them firmly in the #1 spot. The LGA115X family became the backbone of the PC industry. For 10 years, if you bought a mainstream desktop computer from Dell, HP, or any other major brand, or if you built a standard gaming PC, chances are it was powered by one of these sockets. They powered millions upon millions of machines, defining the modern computing experience for an entire decade, and solidifying Intel OOS legacy as the king of the consumer desktop. As we entered the 2020s, the demands on our computers were skyrocketing. 4K gaming, high frame rate streaming, and complex content creation were becoming the norm. The steady, iterative pace of the last decade wasn't going to be enough. It was time for another leap forward, and for Intel, this meant 2 new sockets to carry them into the next generation: LGA1200 and LGA1700. LGA1200 arrived in 2020 as the home for Intel's 10th and 11th generation core processors. On the surface, it looked very similar to its predecessors, but with a slight increase in pin count to 1200. The key focus here was power. As Intel pushed its core counts higher and clock speeds faster to compete with a resurgent AMD, the CPUs needed more stable and robust power delivery. LGA1200 was engineered to provide that, ensuring the new power-hungry chips could run at their full potential. However, it was still firmly rooted in the established technology of the past decade. It was the last stop on the DDR4 memory and PCIe 4.0 train, a final refinement of a mature platform. But its successor, LGA1700, was the true revolution. Launched with the 12th generation Alder Lake processors, LGA1700 was a radical physical and technological departure. The socket itself is visibly different. It's rectangular, not square, reflecting a complete redesign of the processor package. With 1700 contacts, it was built to handle the next era of computing. LGA1700 brought with it 2 monumental changes. The first was the introduction of DDR5 memory. This new memory standard offered a massive increase in bandwidth, feeding the increasingly core-heavy CPUs with the data they craved. The second was the adoption of PCIe 5.0. This new version of the PCI Express interface doubled the speed of the connection to your graphics card and storage drives, unlocking a new level of performance for next-generation GPUs and NVMe SSDs. Furthermore, the Alder Lake, and in Raptor Lake, where processors that call this socket home introduced a revolutionary hybrid architecture, combining powerful, performance cores for demanding tasks with efficiency cores for background processes. This complex design required a sophisticated socket that could manage power and data for these 2 different types of cores seamlessly. LGA1200 and LGA1700 represent a critical transition point. LGA1200 was the powerful, polished culmination of the DDR4 era. LGA1700, on the other hand, was the bold leap into the future, the foundation for DDR5, PCIe 5.0, and a new way of thinking about processor design. It's the platform that bridges the technology of today with the possibilities of tomorrow, setting the stage for whatever comes next in Intel's long and storied history. While Intel was dominating the mid-2000s with its Core 2 architecture, AMD was playing a different game. They might not have always had the fastest chip on the market, but they were building a reputation for something else, something that resonated deeply with builders on a budget. a commitment to the consumer. This philosophy was perfectly embodied by their AM2 and AM3 sockets. In 2006, AMD launched Socket AM2. This was a significant step for them as it marked their transition to the newer, faster DDR2 memory, allowing their popular Athlon 64 and early Phenom CPUs to keep pace. It was a solid, reliable platform that offered great value. But the real genius was what came next. When it was time to move to the even faster DDR3 memory, AMD didn't force everyone to throw their old motherboards away. They introduced Socket AM3, but they designed it with a brilliant twist of backward compatibility. The new AM3 processors had a special memory controller that could work with both DDR3 and the older DDR2 memory. This meant that if you owned a motherboard with a slightly updated socket called AM2+, you could perform a simple BIOS update and drop a brand new, much faster AM3 Phenom 2 or Athlon 2 processor into your old board, still using your old DDR2 RAM. This was an unprecedented upgrade path. It meant you didn't have to buy a new CPU, a new motherboard, and new memory all at once. You could upgrade in stages whenever your budget allowed. This consumer-friendly approach earned AMD immense goodwill. While Intel was changing sockets with nearly every generation, AMD was seen as the company that respected its customers' investment. They were building a community of loyal fans who appreciated that they didn't have to start from scratch every couple of years. The AM2 and AM3 platforms powered some of the most popular and beloved budget and mid-range builds of the late 2000s and early 2010s. The Phenom 2 processors, in particular, were legendary for their overclocking potential and multi-core performance for the price. These sockets weren't just pieces of hardware, they were a statement. They were AMD's promise of longevity and affordability, a promise that laid the crucial groundwork for the revolution that was to come. They were keeping the faith with their audience, a strategy that would soon pay off in the most spectacular way imaginable. Every once in a while in the world of technology, a product comes along that doesn't just compete. It changes the entire landscape. It redefines what consumers should expect and forces the competition to completely rethink their strategy. In the world of CPU sockets, that legend is AM4. Launched in 2017, Socket AM4 was more than just a new platform. It was the vessel for AMD's triumphant return from the brink. It was the unified home for their revolutionary new Zen architecture and the Ryzen processors. For years, AMD had been struggling to compete at the high end. With AM4 and Ryzen, they didn't just compete, they came out swinging. But the masterstroke of AM4 was the promise AMD made on day one. They would support this single socket for years to come. And they kept that promise. For an incredible 6 years, from 2017 to 2022, AM4 was the one and only mainstream socket for AMD. Think about what that meant. You could have bought a motherboard in 2017 with an entry-level Ryzen 3 CPU. A couple of years later, with nothing more than a simple BIOS update, you could pull that old chip out and drop in a much more powerful Ryzen 5 from the next generation. A few years after that, you could do it again, upgrading to a monstrously powerful Ryzen 9 with 16 cores, all on the very same motherboard you started with. This was revolutionary. It was the ultimate expression of the consumer-friendly philosophy AMD had been building for years. It shattered the expectation that a new CPU required a new motherboard. It gave users an unparalleled sense of value and freedom. The AM4 platform evolved, supporting the transition from PCIe 3.0 to the faster PCIe 4.0, and accommodating CPUs from the first generation of Zen all the way through Zen 3. This longevity and upgradability helped AMD recapture a massive amount of market share. Enthusiasts, gamers, and content creators flocked to the platform, not just for the incredible multi-core performance of the Ryzen chips, but for the knowledge that their investment was secure for the long term. AM4 became a symbol of trust between a company and its customers. AM4 wasn't just a socket, it was a paradigm shift. It proved that a platform could be both high performance and long-lasting. It challenged the industry's obsession with yearly motherboard upgrades, and in doing so, created one of the most beloved and respected platforms in the history of personal computing. It truly was the socket that changed everything. After the historic, game-changing run of AM4, the world was watching to see what AMD would do next. How could they possibly follow up such a legendary act? The most immediate and obvious change with AM5 was the move to an LGA design, just like Intel had done years earlier. For the first time in their mainstream desktop history, AMD CPUs no longer had pins. The new AM5 socket features a grid of 1,718 contacts, making the new Ryzen 7000 series and beyond far more robust and easier to install. The era of worrying about bent pins on an AMD chip was finally over. But the changes were far more than skin deep. AM5 was built from the ground up for the next generation of computing. It mandated the use of the new, high-bandwidth DDR5 memory, leaving the older DDR4 standard behind. It also fully embraced PCIe 5.0, not just for the graphics card, but also for cutting-edge storage drives, offering unprecedented data transfer speeds for the most demanding users. This new socket was also designed to deliver more power to the CPU, allowing the latest Ryzen processors to boost to higher clock speeds and sustain that performance for longer periods. It's a platform built for efficiency, power, and speed, designed to be the foundation of AMD's performance leadership for years to come. Crucially, however, AMD made a new promise. AM5 represents the maturation of AMD. They've taken the lessons from their revolutionary past and combined them with the cutting-edge technologies of the future. It's a platform that delivers a massive leap in performance today, while still honoring the promise of long-term value that rebuilt their kingdom. It sets the stage for the next great chapter in the ongoing battle for the future of computing. So far, our story has focused on the sockets that power the computers on our desks and in our homes. But beyond this mainstream world lies another realm entirely. A realm where core counts multiply, memory channels double, and then double again, and performance has virtually no limits. This is the world of high-end desktop, HEDT, and server sockets. These are not for checking email or playing the latest games. These are the engines of creation, discovery, and the internet itself. On the enthusiast side, for those who demand the absolute most from their personal computers, professional video editors, 3D animators, to feed all those cores, they don't just have 2 channels of memory. They have quad-channel memory, effectively doubling the data highway to the CPU. They also boast an enormous number of PCIe lanes, allowing users to install multiple graphics cards, high-speed storage arrays, and other expansion cards without creating a bottleneck. These are the platforms that power Hollywood visual effects studios and cutting-edge research labs. And then we go one level higher. We enter the world of enterprise servers, the silent, humming hearts of our digital world. Here, the sockets are even more immense. Platforms like AMD's SP3 and SP5 and Intel's LGA4189 are built for a singular purpose: maximum computational density and reliability. These sockets are home to processors like AMD's EPYC and Intel's Xeon, chips that can have up to 128 cores and can be installed in dual socket configurations on a single motherboard. They support 8 or even 12 channels of specialized server memory, allowing for terabytes of RAM. They are built for the massive data centers run by Google, Amazon, and Microsoft. They power the AI models we interact with, the cloud services we use every day, and the scientific supercomputers that are curing diseases and simulating the universe. These sockets are the unsung heroes of the modern age. They are monuments of engineering, designed for performance at a scale that is almost hard to comprehend. They show us what is possible when cost is no object, and the only goal is to push the boundaries of what a computer can do. They are the true titans of the silicon world. So, what have we learned from this journey through the history of the CPU socket? We've seen a story that began with a moment of universal harmony in Socket 7, shattered by a bold but brief experiment with cartridges, and then settled into a decades-long rivalry that pushed technology forward at an incredible pace. We saw how a simple, brilliant idea, flipping the pins from the CPU to the motherboard with LGA1700, could solve a problem that plagued builders for years. We witnessed a decade of steady, relentless refinement from Intel with their 115X family, a strategy that built an empire. And then, we watched as AMD, The determined underdog changed the entire game with AM4, proving that respecting your customer's investment could be the most powerful weapon of all. The legacy of the CPU socket is a story of relentless progress. But it's more than that. It's a mirror reflecting the constant dance between innovation and competition. Every new design, from the powerhouse server sockets to the one powering the machine you're watching this on, is a product of this dynamic. Intel's dominance pushed AMD to innovate, and AMD's resurgence with Ryzen and AM4 forced Intel to respond with more cores and new technologies. In the end, who is the ultimate winner of this war? We are. The consumer. And that brings us to the lesson. The story of the CPU socket teaches us something incredibly valuable that we can apply to our own lives, especially when making decisions about technology. It teaches us to look beyond the flashy numbers and the marketing hype. It teaches us to think about the platform, the ecosystem, and the long-term plan. Are you investing in something that is a dead end? Or is there a path forward? Is a company trying to lock you into their ecosystem? Or are they giving you freedom and choice? AMD's success with AM4 wasn't just about core counts. It was about trust and a promise of future value. That's a powerful lesson. Sometimes the smartest choice isn't just about the best performance today, but the best possibilities for tomorrow. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey today. I hope you found it as fascinating as I do. I wish you all the very best of health and happiness. If you enjoyed this deeper dive into the world of technology, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more stories like this.